Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Bitter Pill and happy holidays of whatever sort you're having. So I'm doing another video on impeachment, but I'm going to try to keep this one a lot shorter than the one that I made a few days ago. And as usual, I'll put links in the description. I probably won't spend much time on the links I'm going to uh, look at. So basically, this is a response to a video made by a YouTube uh, podcaster named Tim Black that criticized Tulsi Gabbard's vote to abstain, a present vote on the resolutions calling for Donald Trump's impeachment. Tim received a lot of criticism for this video, and he responded on Twitter by saying, "There must be 1,000 angry pro-Tulsi comments on my latest video. They are livid because I disagree with Tulsi and Jimmy Dore. They think it was brave of Tulsi to disagree with the Democrats. You know what I think is brave? Disagreeing with Tulsi Gabbard and Jimmy Dore." That's interesting. So it's brave, I guess, to go along with all the Democrats who voted for impeachment, all 200 and some odd of them. And it's not brave to be the sore thumb that sticks out and doesn't vote for it. Okay. Anyway, really, I thought this video was, his video was superficial and not very well researched. And his response to criticisms of it that I'm showing you here, it's kind of dismissive. And it's disingenuous because there was a pretense that folks reacting negatively to it and critical of it were just angry. How would he necessarily know what their feelings are, right? Depends on what they said, I guess. But there was this implication that there weren't any substantive reasons given for folks' disagreement with Tim's assertion that Tulsi made a bad decision with her present vote on impeachment. Well, they did, Tim, and I don't recall you addressing any of them in your video. Now, mind you, Tim, I'm not canceling you. I don't hate you or something. I actually kind of like you, even though I currently support Tulsi's campaign. And I certainly don't get angry at someone just because they criticize her. I have criticisms of my own, and I didn't like I don't like her opposition to the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movements around the Palestine issue, for example. So I started following Tim early this year, and I really like some of the stuff he's put out, actually. Tim, I was really impressed with the video you did where you defended and interviewed Aidan Cook, a man who disrupted a speech by Kamala Harris to call on her to oppose prosecutions of whistleblowers who called out abusive and illegal practices in factory farms and to raise the issue of animal agriculture is not only cruelty to animals but major contribution to climate change. And I actually wound up writing, here's Tim's interview with the animal rights activist who disrupted Kamala Harris. As you can see there, he's a white man, and Kamala Harris is a woman of color, so that's what he got flack for. So I actually wound up writing an article about this incident, and your video, Tim, was one of the sources that I cited. And I was really impressed with how you broke down the video that someone took of Aidan Cook's protest to show that Aidan went to great lengths to make clear that he was not only, that he wasn't a threat, but was only there to make a point. And you had Aidan on your show so that Aidan could explain his controversial protest in his own words. Actually, Aidan refers to himself as they. I'm sorry about that, but it just gets kind of awkward with the pronoun usage sometimes. Anyway, Tim also courageously went against the grain of all the fake social justice warriors who excoriated Cook with all sorts of name-calling and other representation for being a white man who dared to protest a woman of color, and agreed with Aidan that we shouldn't decide who should be, quote-unquote, allowed to protest whom based on the gender and ethnicity of the protester and the target of the protest. But that's a far cry from what you did in your video about Tulsi Gabbard's present vote on the House resolutions to impeach Donald Trump. So you showed a brief clip of her explaining very briefly why she voted present on the impeachment resolutions. And you said, contrary to what supporters of Tulsi Gabbard have claimed, I don't think it's courageous to take a present vote. I don't think it's courageous in any way. And then you went on to misquote her, saying, I want to center the country, and misrepresenting her stance as advocating centrist neoliberalism or centrism. You said corruption is wrong and you can't center corruption. Well, I mean, you tell me, does this look like a centrist policy record? So she put forth a resolution censuring Trump, actually two of them. Resolution calling for withdrawal of troops from Syria. She's original sponsor on those two. Original sponsor on the No More Presidential Wars Act, calling it unconstitutional, basically making explicit the requirement that any act of war by the United States have the approval of Congress and not just be presidents doing things on their own, which they've been doing for some decades now. The Stop Arming Terror, well, I mean, on and on. Legalizing marijuana, the only climate change bill that's been introduced into Congress so far, legislation to regulate Wall Street, opposition to all kinds of wars and military coups, such as a recent coup in Bolivia. The only member of Congress, at least at the time, to protest at Standing Rock against the Dakota Access Pipeline, supports freedom and exoneration for Julian Assange, Edward Snowden, and Chelsea Manning, and so on. And just a very progressive record and not in any way, shape, or form centrist. So Tim goes on kind of an extended free association, having nothing to do with Tulsi's position regarding how we want to address corruption and other bad things. And he claims that it's more risky or courageous to cast a yes vote than a present vote. Well, I mentioned this before. There were 230 people in the House, Democrats in the House, who voted yes on the first resolution to impeach Donald Trump, the one calling out his possible misdeeds with respect to Ukraine, where it's alleged that he pressured Ukraine by withholding military aid in order to get Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden. We'll come back to that. But, I mean, going along with a crowd of 230 people in your party is more risky or courageous than being one of three to go against those 230 fellow Democrats. Two Democrats voted no. Tulsi Gabbard was the one vote in Congress for present or abstention. Tim said Tulsi's vote doesn't change anything and doesn't do anything. And that if she thinks he shouldn't have been impeached, then she should have voted no. Well, actually, she thinks that he should have been impeached, as she discusses in her statement, not the brief clip that Tim showed, but a longer statement that she issued and made a video of regarding her reasoning for impeachment. And so Tim goes on for a while talking about this and that, mostly irrelevant to the subject matter at hand, I'm afraid. And finally, about 12 minutes in, he says how he would have voted on impeachment. He says he would have voted yes. and never really gives a specific explanation of why. It's just kind of, well, Trump did stuff that's impeachable, so anybody who believes that should just automatically vote for impeachment. But I mean, let's consider the specific articles of impeachment that were up for consideration. Basically, the charge is that he blackmailed Ukraine by threatening to withhold military aid if they didn't investigate Joe Biden regarding his attempts to prevent an investigation, or alleged attempts to prevent an investigation of his son, Hunter Biden, for corruption regarding a Ukrainian energy company that he was on the board of. So, that's what the first part of the resolution was about, not anything else. So the question then is, did the House inquiry really prove that he did what he's accused of doing? Well, I mean, if you look through the transcript of the phone call between Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky, I'll put a link in the video description, you don't find any sort of threat from Donald Trump to withhold military aid if Ukraine didn't investigate his potential political opponent, Joe Biden. That's just not there. And Ukrainian officials also say that they aren't aware of any quid pro quo where we'll give you military aid if you'll give us, an investigation of Joe and Hunter Biden. So maybe they're not telling the truth. Who knows? Maybe there's something going on there, and we just don't know about it. But the point is, how does anybody in Congress have any business voting for this specific impeachment resolution if they are not sure beyond a reasonable doubt that Donald Trump is guilty of what it's alleged he did? Now, I think that the second impeachment article, that he obstructed the investigation, seems to have more clear-cut evidence for it. But I mean, why would that have even happened if this? It wouldn't have happened if this investigation hadn't occurred. So it's kind of secondary. But anyway. So Tim kind of rambles about various other things. He doesn't buy Russiagate, he says. Well, fine, neither do I. But what's that got to do with Tulsi Gabbard's vote on impeachment? Then he talks about how nobody should defend Donald Trump's actions, that he's done a lot of things that are indefensible. Again, I completely agree. So does Tulsi. She criticizes him all the time. But what's that got to do with her vote on impeachment? Another thing that Tim brings up is how politics are so corrupt in the United States that people just kind of accept or take for granted that they're corrupt. Okay, that's true, but what's that got to do with Tulsi Gabbard's vote on impeachment? He talks about how it's Tulsi Gabbard's right to vote the way she did, that she earned her seat through hard work. Lots of other stuff that has nothing to do with the subject at hand. And there's never any real discussion of her reasoning about why she voted the way she did, other than the misrepresentation of that I mentioned earlier. Now, if you watch the video clip that Tim shows, she mentions that she put forward a resolution to censure the president. Let's see, I'm not sure if I have it up here. Hold on. Okay, I thought I had this up before, but I didn't. My apologies. Okay, here it is. And this isn't the actual resolution. This is her press release regarding it, but the text is the same. So she talks about how she thinks that there's significant wrongdoing in terms of Donald Trump's conduct in his interactions with Ukraine, that he did appear to have solicited Ukrainian intervention in the 2020 U.S. presidential election in terms of soliciting the government of Ukraine to investigate his political rival, or at least potential political rival, Joe Biden. But she goes on to mention several other things that are really, one could argue, much more serious. Violated the War Powers Resolution in Article 1 of the Constitution by carrying out acts of war without congressional approval. Illegally and unconstitutionally using U.S. military forces to occupy and pillage oil field reserves of Syria, which Tulsi Gabbard actually introduced a congressional resolution calling him out for that and calling on the U.S. to withdraw troops from Syria, and pointing out that this use of U.S. military forces was illegal and unconstitutional because it didn't have the approval of Congress, and it's obviously illegal under international law to just go in and occupy part of a country that hasn't done anything to you. Continued support for Saudi Arabia's genocidal war in Yemen. Recklessly abandoning nuclear agreements and treaties like the INF treaty with Russia and the Iran nuclear agreement, thereby increasing the risk of nuclear war, nuclear proliferation, and war with Iran. And I talked in the last video about how this too is unconstitutional. The president can't just unilaterally walk away from treaties with other countries without congressional approval. So anyway, she points all these things out and calls on Congress, to the House of Representatives, to censure Donald Trump for these various actions. And the resolution didn't get anywhere. Got referred to committee immediately. No co-sponsors. So her colleagues didn't want to censure Donald Trump. They wanted to push forward this impeachment resolution. But for what? They had a pretty weak case, and I can't imagine the Senate is going to come anywhere close to convicting Donald Trump. So, how is this anything other than political grandstanding? So Tim concedes that the drive to impeach Donald Trump over the alleged Ukraine quid pro quo military aid for investigation of Biden will probably help Trump's re-election bid. And you can actually look at poll numbers here. I mean, not all the polls are this way. This is just one poll, but there have been a number of polls like this where Trump is beating every single one of the Democratic Party candidates currently. And again, the polls are all over the place. So there are polls that go the other way, or polls that show things about dead even. But my point is that it wasn't this way. Certainly not 2 or 3 years ago, before Russiagate started getting ramped up, and there was much more focus on the real wrongdoing of Donald Trump. There were mass demonstrations about his abuse of women and his reactionary immigration policy and so forth. And he was clearly very unpopular at the time, and not so much the case anymore. So, Tim, what was that you said early in your video about a present vote, the present vote that Tulsi Gabbard made, not accomplishing anything good? Well, what about a yes vote? What the hell does that accomplish that's worthwhile? We know that the impeachment is going to be thrown out in the Senate. I can't imagine any other outcome. And you yourself, Tim, said that the Democrats are probably hurting themselves in the polls. So what the hell is this all for? Do you really want Trump to be defeated in November 2020? Or is it more important to you to engage in this sort of political posturing that it's obvious, given the merits of this specific impeachment case, that's what the Democrats are doing. So from the sound of things in Tim's video, political posturing is more important to him than actual negative consequences to Donald Trump for his wrongdoing, i.e., him being voted out of office, hopefully in favor of a decent candidate like, say, Bernie Sanders, but we'll see. So that's what Tulsi Gabbard wants to happen. Because she knows this, anybody with any common sense knows that the Senate is not going to convict Donald Trump. So if you really want negative consequences for his actions, then you need to make a case to the public that he's done some things that warrant his being removed from office in November 2020. So another thing that Tim talks about in his video is how really, if you look at the record of pretty much any president in recent history, they could and should have been impeached for war crimes. That includes Obama, Bush, Clinton, the previous Bush, Reagan. They all committed some kind of war crimes, serious war crimes. Some of them, certainly George Bush, have been involved in torturing people. Now, of course, Donald Trump also has committed war crimes, as we have previously discussed, or as I have previously discussed, and Tulsi Gabbard pointed out in her impeachment resolution. Ralph Nader and his colleagues actually have a more extensive list of impeachable crimes. I talked about that in the last video. So, since Tim brings that up, that kind of begs the question, which he doesn't address. Why have any of these presidents, including Donald Trump, not been impeached for these serious crimes? Waging war without congressional approval, violations of international law, torture in some cases, etc. Why didn't any of these Democrats that you call brave for voting to impeach Donald Trump, why didn't they try to impeach him for something much more serious? That he definitely committed. There's not really any work that needs to be done to prove that U.S. troops are occupying Syrian oil fields, and that's unconstitutional and a violation of international law. Those are just facts. Why haven't any of them, hardly any of them anyway, even mentioned them? You know who has mentioned them? Tulsi Gabbard. In her censure resolution and elsewhere, and other things that she's said. So how exactly is she letting Donald Trump off the hook by pointing out crimes that he's committed that her fellow Democrats are not pointing out? Now, it's true that her censure resolution doesn't call for impeachment, but her colleagues won't even mention these other impeachable offenses, so it's a pretty good bet that they're never ever going to try to impeach him for them. So that's not exactly her fault, now is it? But what can come of a censure resolution is that Donald Trump's crimes will become more well publicized, and the American people will be more likely to vote against Donald Trump in the fall. Now, assuming that, which, that's not at all a safe assumption, I guess, because, Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg versus Donald Trump, in my opinion, at least, pick your poison. But if a Democratic candidate who is significantly better than Donald Trump is the nominee, then, I would hope Tim would be in favor of Democrats making the best possible case they could for that candidate's election, which involves calling out all of Donald Trump's misdeeds, as well as other things, campaigning for Medicare for all and so on and so forth. But instead, what seems fairly likely to happen now is that although Donald Trump's been impeached, the case is going to get thrown out in the Senate, and he's going to be able to claim during his campaign, he already is claiming this, with some justification, because case hasn't really been proved. That doesn't mean it's not true that he engaged in this quid pro quo with Ukraine, but the case is shaky. So he's going to be able to claim with some justification, perhaps, that he was railroaded by the Democrats and rightfully exonerated in the Senate over charges that, at least in their most severe form, the quid pro quo, haven't been proven. Now, that doesn't, of course, mean that it's his place to be asking the president of Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden, a potential political opponent, regardless of whether he blackmailed Ukraine or not. But I come back to the point that she made that Tim kind of garbled in his summary of what she said about the partisan nature of the impeachment. Tim never explicitly, he never correctly frames what it was she was saying there. But what she's saying is, well, look at the vote totals on the impeachment resolutions. 230 Democrats in favor of resolution number 1, the one about the Ukraine stuff. 229 in favor of the obstruction of the investigation issue. Tulsi Gabbard standing alone, abstaining, voting present. 2 of her fellow Democrats voting no, and every single one of the Republicans voting no, voting against the impeachment resolution. There were far more Democrats voting for Bill Clinton's impeachment over lying over a blowjob, and more Republicans voting against than there are Democrats voting against Trump's impeachment, too. And there were no Republicans voting for Trump's impeachment. If we look back 21 years ago when Clinton was impeached, Jerry Nadler, who's still in Congress, now a Democrat in Congress, was a leader of the Democrats' fight against Clinton's impeachment back then. And he argued that it was inappropriate and contrary to what the Founding Fathers intended for impeachment to be a highly partisan affair. Now, where have we heard that? From somebody else? Tulsi Gabbard said exactly that. That's in her statement about her reasons for not supporting the impeachment. So why all of a sudden is Nadler's argument that he made 21 years ago that impeachments shouldn't be just this which party has more votes for their side kind of thing? There should be an actual impartial investigation, and charges should be proved, and thus bipartisan support to some extent can be attained. But that's not what we have here. So why is it that Nadler's argument against the merits of impeaching Clinton back then, that it was totally partisan, why is that all of a sudden invalid now when Tulsi Gabbard is making that same exact argument? Back to the previous question of why didn't the Democrats try to impeach Trump on the other things that Tulsi mentioned in her censure resolution? Why didn't they try to impeach Obama, Bush, Clinton, the other Bush, Reagan, for their many impeachable offenses that were all far worse than Clinton lying about receiving a blowjob from an intern? So, as Tim likes to say, come on, Johnson. You know the answer. It's because they were all corrupt too. So if you look at the transcript of that phone call between Trump and Zelensky, one thing you'll notice is that Trump actually spends a lot more time talking about and urging the Ukrainian government to investigate what happened with CrowdStrike and the server, he says, which, I mean, if you don't know the details, then what he's referring to may be a little bit unclear. But what he's urging Zelensky to have investigated is the efforts by the Democrats to dig up dirt on him during the 2016 election with the help of the Ukrainian government at the time. So basically, the Clinton campaign and other top Democrats, the DNC, Obama administration officials as well, were, according to the evidence that we have, doing exactly the same thing to Trump that Trump is accused of doing to Biden, trying to pressure the Ukrainian government to dig up dirt on a political opponent. And that actually happened. They dug up dirt on one of Trump's top campaign people, Paul Manafort, and gave it to the Democrats, and Manafort got in big trouble. Let's also not forget that we know for a fact, due to WikiLeaks and release of DNC emails and some other evidence, that the Clinton campaign and the DNC interfered in the 2016 election. In other words, they interfered in the primary to bias the outcome in favor of Hillary Clinton and against Bernie Sanders. They went out of their way to sabotage Bernie Sanders. We know this. So now they're investigating, these same Democrats are investigating Trump for interfering with an election. Well, what about their interference in the 2016 election? And should Joe Biden not be investigated? Granted, it's not Trump's place to ask a foreign government to investigate somebody who's potentially his general election opponent in 2020. It's an ethical violation. I'm not sure I don't think it's sufficient grounds for impeachment just because of the political ramifications. It's inevitably going to be a very partisan affair, especially if you can't prove it. Well, you can prove that, but I mean, because that is in the phone call, but is it enough to warrant impeachment? Well, the Republicans certainly don't think so. So what the heck was Hunter Biden doing getting $50,000 a year from Burisma, a Ukrainian natural gas company, or Ukrainian energy company, just for sitting on their board, more or less doing nothing for $50,000 a year? And there's a lot to Joe Biden's involvement with Ukraine. There's evidence that he was one of several U.S. officials involved in facilitating the military coup that took place in Ukraine in 2014, which overthrew a democratically elected government and brought to power a government that was full of fascists, literal fascists, goose-stepping, Nazi-saluting fucking fascists. Our government helped make that happen, and Joe Biden was involved. And then, a few months later, all of a sudden, Hunter Biden's on the board of Burisma, making $50,000 a year for that. And not too long after that, amidst indications that Ukraine's chief prosecutor was investigating the company that Hunter Biden worked for, Mr. Biden later told us what happened. Basically he said, of course he didn't admit that it had anything to do with his, son being investigated. We're not really sure, I guess, 100% that the investigation included investigation of Hunter Biden, but Burisma was being investigated by a Ukrainian prosecutor. Joe Biden pressured the Ukrainian government to fire him by withholding a massive aid package to Ukraine, and lo and behold, all of a sudden, the prosecutor was fired. I'm really trying to get this video done, so I'm not going to play Joe Biden's admission of this on TV, but I'll put it in the video description. So, in short, the Democrats can't go after Trump on more serious charges than the stuff with Ukraine, such as war crimes, because they too are guilty of them. They're studiously avoiding mentioning the fact and counting on the media mostly to go along with it, that they too have engaged in election interference. As Tulsi Gabbard has pointed out on many occasions, and many of us who are not members of Congress or presidential candidates have also pointed out, the rotting corruption in Washington is on both sides of the aisle. Both the Democratic and Republican parties are just full of corruption. Only a couple of days before the Democrats voted to impeach Donald Trump, claiming that he was, quote, a threat to national security, the overwhelming majority of Democrats in the House and the Senate, 82% of the House Democrats and about 85% of Senate Democrats, voted to approve Donald Trump's $738 billion military budget. They also voted to renew the Patriot Act. They voted, as a lot of them have been doing, to approve many of Trump's appointments to judgeships, to the courts. And even, what do you know, voted to fund Donald Trump's wall. So Tulsi Gabbard is one of the few who didn't vote for any of this. And she voted against the military budget and did not go along with any of what I've just mentioned. So, in short, not only was this effort to impeach Trump useless because it's not going to result in conviction, Trump isn't going to be held accountable in that regard by the Senate, and this may very well help his re-election campaign. But not only that, this was just a giant exercise in hypocrisy. And many, many Americans can see that. Why can't you, Tim? Okay, well, that's about all I have to say about this. And as usual, I'll put links to relevant content in the description of the video. So if you like this content, give me a like, subscribe to the channel, and if you really like it, hop on over to Patreon and contribute to the bitter pill with whatever you can chip in. So long for now, and happy holidays, y'all.